an honor, of course, to have Thom Mayne here to speak to us all. The best graduate class we'll ever all have, I'm sure. And he has had such an illustrious career for such a long period of time, starting the architectural firm Morphosis in 1972, PST-ART, and all of the educational work that has come from UCLA in architecture and urban design. He has shaped Los Angeles and many other cities as well. The beautiful Caltrans building downtown, I'm sure you all know. And has been recognized enormously, Pritzker Prize, and exhibitions that have happened of his drawings and his models and his work overall in really adventurous ways at Pompidou, at the Museum of Modern Art, at Walker Art Center. And he has really, through his educational practice and his architectural practice, shaped how we all see modern architecture. So when he started making, beyond these extraordinary works that were sculptural models, we really had the privilege of visiting him at his laboratory that he called Straight On Cafe, and watched as these things were being developed. So we are very pleased to be able to be presenting this, the first exhibition in the United States, particularly of his paintings per se, or his multimedia works. And he is going to guide us through the process of what he's done, and we'll open it up to conversations following a really kind of somewhat brief introduction. He can casually do this off the cuff and did so in a small group recently here in the gallery that so inspired us all that we had to tape this one so we could share it with the world. I know, please welcome Thom Mayne, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Kim. I put together a few images. I was going to just chat, and I decided it would be more interesting maybe to show you some kind of images. But I'd like to actually just set up a conversation. I'm going to try to do it very briefly, 20 minutes or something. But what I would like to talk about is the origin of this work. And it comes from a project I've been working on for really 4 decades, if not more. And it also, being here in this framework is kind of interesting for me, because it's the beginning of a new direction into my own artistic life. And that I started out as a young architect, but I was in an era, the 70s, that you could produce conceptual work through drawings and models. And I'd already had established somewhat of a notion of who I was through that process before I was building architecture. And it was, I think it'd be much more difficult to do that today, but it was absolutely possible at this particular period of time. It was a support structure that you were invited to competitions, and you actually had people interested in your drawings. And so in a way, and then I was invited to do Blythe. He would send me off to do lectures here and there to pay the bills, and I'm doing AIA things all over the country. And the conversation was always, as I showed my work, because it was drawings, oh, you're not really an architect, you're an artist. And it took me a while before I was building buildings that they would accept me as an architect, because I was a person who was working through conceptual kind of thinking. And so I'm kind of aware at this point in my life, it's quite symmetrical. I'm now doing what I did when I was 25 years old, and I'm doing it as a kind of my major kind of focus right now is working again with ideas, but through the medium of paintings, drawings, etc. I'm going to take you through, it's really hard to go through something lineal because I'm not a lineal thinker. And these things come in different places, and I'm often not even clear where these things come from. And I work immensely kind of intuitive, and I just make decisions, and it happens through just an instantaneous kind of connection of dots, right? And they tend to be not sequential in my case, right? And in many cases, I'm not even sure where it is coming from, and I don't concern myself with it. And I'm also a person that's, in terms of my creative world, and it's been this way from the beginning, I just go to work. I don't expect lightning bolts or anything to happen. I show up at 8 o'clock and I do it 6 times a day, and I do it for years and years, and just stuff happens. And it happens through the work, right? And I'm responding, and I'm myself. It's a dialogue, and that's going to be very much kind of a beginning of what this work is. Well, in this period of time, I'm the last of a generation that was trained conventionally, drawing and model making through the hand. And I'm in my undergraduate education at USC, which was a school that very much involved you in a group of people that formed the architecture of California. It was the case study, just everybody knows it came from Neutra and Schindler, right? And it was definitely connected to a tradition of architecture which you could start in the beginning of the modern movement, let's say, as they challenged classicism, right? And it was connected to two characters from Vienna that brought this kind of series here, and then it kind of took off with a group of people, many of them being my teachers. But in 1968, when I'm at USC, it was the kind of end of that era, and it somewhat exhausted, and we took them on. And our job as young people was to challenge that, and we had no interest in the Pierre Koenigs and the Craig Elwoods and the Gregorians and this area. As a series of very good architects, which I'm probably now 40 as I came around and said, oh, I actually worked with some interesting characters that I never kind of acknowledged as I was taking them on. But I grew up in an era that it was hard to compete with Jimi Hendrix. And and we could go on and on, all right? And or Muhammad Ali, or Malcolm X, and we could go on. And they were asking questions. And regardless of your political or cultural or social connection, it was irrelevant. They were asking questions, and they were very, very kind of primary things. And they were challenging the most kind of fundamental notions of who we are as human character, et cetera, right? And that was the era that took us someplace. And we were following some, well, I guess parallel to that, we were maybe, in versus maybe the current generation, we were still very much connected to the ideals of the first modern characters. We were directly connected to ideas of Corbusier's and the Mies van der Rohe's, et cetera, and the changes taking place at the beginning of the 20th century, all of which were instigated at the end of the 19th century, and we're now talking about Darwin and Einstein and et cetera, right? And the world is moving from a static to a dynamic place. And that's where I'm starting. Well, so now I'm going to start our talk with these things, because I won't explain these things literally. They are what they are, and I have no interest in explaining them in literal terms. I'm trying to kind of locate them. And to start with, I'm showing a piece of work that's it's me, but it's Cyborg, and I'm aware now what's taken place from this beginning classical training, classical meaning again the hand, right, is the digital world, and it appeared in 1995. Isan, one of my partners, and it really started changing how we think about kind of inventing stuff. Right, and it was happening fairly quickly, and so by already the next century, in 5 years, it was already pretty much integrated, right? And from there, it's operating in a way that's really taking over a lot of these traditions, and as part of that, and I looked at this, I realized these are from my cyborg self. They're part biological and they're part digital. And the digital world today, and I'll get into it more specifically, essentially just expands enormously your capability of making decisions with large numbers of a huge amount of information, and allows you for the degree of variation which is at the basis of any creative act, which is discretionary. You do something, you make a decision, you do something else, you keep changing it, and it's a continuous reiterative process as you invent something. Right? And this tool radically advances this. Instead of what Kiesler says, you can think of 7 things simultaneously, I can now deal with hundreds of things with this tool, and it's just basically advances you. And I also want to say, with this particular Todd, it's in no way interested in any literal notion of the computer that's doing the thinking. It's using it as a tool that advances our own thinking. Blythe, you wanted to make sure I didn't, what was your notion? Not get it confused with the whole AI conversation. That would be another conversation. It's actually an interesting one. My sense is it's finally the nature of us as human characters, which are incredibly, we're closer to Freud than we are to the rationalism. It's going to be a while before we're going to capture that, and it's still a tool, and it can think, but it's incredibly mimetic. It just takes what's there and finds some sort of a commonality and produces a variation of that, which is for me quite boring. It's a backward kind of process. Anyway, but these are all connected to this process. The project starts with an interest in chance, and it's not my project. It's a project I'm participating on that's been going on for a century. And it's going to start very literally with Duchamp and his 3 stoppages, or we could go to the nude descending. We could use any number of his pieces, and he's radically kind of shifting the notion of what we even call art, and it's moving to something that's no longer connected primarily to the physical act of representing something and the material act of producing something, but it's mental. And it's the proclamation of calling something art as an idea. And obviously the urinal was the clear kind of conversation. And he had a complete sense of humor because he picked something that was purposely kind of to push the idea of the kind of overimportance of the formal act of painting in this case. And but it's interested in chance. And it's something that I somehow just intuitively, instinctively got interested in quite early in my career, in the notion of organizing randomness and absorbing the density and the complexity and the conflicts within the world around us in terms of making the work and challenging any kind of singular idea of order that comes from a single system. And I was interested in that complexity that comes out of that. And it was very much connected to chance behavior. And of course, these are people that you're aware of very early. And we're looking at ARP. And he's throwing the pieces of his painting on the ground and then proclaiming that more interesting than what he's trying to look for. And then there's an argument with Richter, who's claiming it's his idea, and that's a whole other kind of conversation, but the notion of the randomness of throwing something. And this is going to now be something that's going to occupy the 20th century. So you go halfway through now, we're looking at Pollock, and he's now kind of throwing the work. And again, it's another method of kind of challenging it. Comes directly from the Duchamp kind of idea, but it's having to do with looking at randomness, et cetera, as a primary idea. But in the process, there's other things taking place. By throwing the paint, if you see the pieces at the Guggenheim in Venice, there's the last 2 pieces he did, the brush is still touching the canvas, and then next to that, the first 2 that he's throwing it, and they're amazingly similar. And so it's kind of a very simple thing, probably. It's not complicated. He just decided instead of touching it, let's just do this, right? And he's, but he's going to do it horizontally. And so now it's going to be complicated what the invention was, because the easel is gone. And again, that's this major thing in painting, the easel, right? And he's painting horizontally, and he's opening up whole new possibilities, right, that are taking place in terms of what we call painting. But it's still a kind of another notion of chance behavior. And then with Sarah, and again, a lot of these things I put together now in the last 10 years or so, we're kind of full on in this idea now. Of randomness and chance behavior and chaos, a certain kind of chaos. And I'm looking at these things now, and I'm going, there's my own thing, there's not enough kind of consciousness or kind of organization in this. And I understand the big idea that's taking place as he distributes this asphalt on the ground. But it's going to be something that's going to be kind of, I'm part of this project, but I'm making my own critique of kind of where I want to be situated within this. And so you get the silhouette, and I'm all of a sudden much closer to notions that occupy me, especially as an architect, of ordering things, and the method of organizing and giving coherence to things. And in some way, I would say that the most basic notion of an architect is we give coherence to things. We order things, right? And then the argument is the method by which we make that coherence, et cetera. And it starts the conversation. But then looking at this, he's working definitely under a methodology which is very parallel to my interest in the work in this room, and that it's method-driven and it's rule-driven. And in this case, of course, he's giving the rules out, and it's kind of fascinating, kind of what he gave. He gave the actual mechanical notion over to the public, to the user, right? But it's not rich enough in its differentiation. So especially the one on the wall, you're looking at a system that uses very straightforward primitives, lines that are organized in different directions, and he's giving you multiple variations that come out of that system. But I'm going, a little too intellectual. It doesn't finally congeal into something that has a bit more power, that gives you a notion of understanding, the notion of differentiation, right? That it's taking you someplace that has some sort of a feedback loop. And then got another kind of shift of conversation, and it's going to connect to my architectural world as it begins the world of drawing or painting. And it's going to be Nazca, and in this case, a piece of artwork from Libius Woods. And it's going to be about landscape markings at a huge scale, and it's going to have an enormous effect on me as an architect. And quite early on, it's going to start showing up in the work having to do with the relationship of site and the relationship of ground, and the work begins by the shaping or the augmentation of site, et cetera. And then that's going to be continued with interest in the more primitive notion, whether it's the Chaco Canyon, where again, the differentiation between shaping ground and city and building and community are more or less singular, right? And then with that, I came across this image maybe 40 years ago, and I thought it was a photograph of a lunar surface, and it's a micro film of a cell of an onion. And I became absolutely fascinated with this image, and I've been working with it for 40 years. And I was interested in the type of organization that comes out of Darwinian natural selection and the complexity of the organization that has to do with this, that I connect to some notion of compellingness or beauty. And again, there's another kind of side conversation. I've been interested in a work that's somewhat non-cultural. It's somehow universal. I'm looking for the notion of what makes something, what do we mean by beauty, or what do we mean by compellingness, that's not based on culture, right? It's not based on a cultural notion of beauty, right? And it's something beyond that. It's going to, in my mind, connect to the natural world. And it's going to take me in, and I'm trying to find something, and I still look at this, and I'm trying to produce this. I'm still in the absolutely same place. I'm trying to produce the complexity and the variation. And then, of course, I'm literally just coming out of school and starting my own thinking as an architect, and there's double negative, and it changed me completely. I'm a trained architect, a young architect, and I'm making things that sit on landscape, and they're objects, and they're things, and this guy shows up, and ooh, it's an era now when there's really serious thinking about painting, and he's leaving his studio in New York and buying a tractor along with Terrell and this whole thing that's going on, and painting's dead, right? Because these are conventional. I'm totally aware that I'm comfortable with the idea that painting still has a life, right? But I've been through, when I was a young man, the notion that it was over with. There was a complete revolution, and it includes the Laurie Andersons, and et cetera, right? That art was radically expanding in terms of what we call art, right? And kind of the most interesting stuff was all in this territory. Maybe you could say it wasn't maybe painting. That was the most interesting, right? Anyway, this was taking place, and it's going to have a profound effect along with the running fence, and it's going to have a profound effect on the work, and it's going to connect again to the organizational ideas, which have to do with chance behavior, but it's going to have to do with now the relationship of natural systems, and it's how they operate to make complex things. And I'm looking for somehow finding parallels to that. And then I'm drawing, I'm recording things visually. And I'm aware that I'm a person that operates in that world, and I much more operate in this world than I do the verbal world. Is kind of a mystery to me. And it's the world that I translate that means something to me, and I'm where we Blythe, we're in Akamal on a beach, and no matter where I am, I'm just absorbing stuff and putting it down, and I'm like you'd be a discussion with maybe more musicians. I'm trying to shut off my brain, actually. I'm working, and I'm working very quickly, and I'm trying not to think, right? Versus again, I'm coming out of the Corbusian idea that you draw slowly and you're thinking as you draw, and I'm the opposite. It's going to be this, right? And I'm operating at a different level, and this could be continuous. And I'm producing all different types of drawings and representing ideas. And what's happening at this point in my architectural practice, because when I'm developing a practice, is I'm extremely aware that these drawings are both connected and disconnected. And I got very aware at this time that they were autonomous. And it was kind of interesting because I was starting to be at a place where the drawings were supporting me at this point, and they were autonomous. And I was being talked about, or architecture at that point in my generation was being talked about in terms of ideas, and it could come out of drawings and models and maquettes, et cetera, and writing, right? It didn't necessarily have to be the work, et cetera. And there are definitely various mediums, and I'm practicing. And some of them, they're going to vary a bit, and some are going to be highly architectural, and they're still absolutely connected to the architectural world. And some of them are going to be kind of in between. They're, again, looking for randomness and chance, and they're looking for kind of a relaxedness and a dynamic that I can produce in the drawing that isn't literally connected to the work. And then something else is happening, and it's I can't tell you why, but I got interested in the three-dimensionality of drawings, and I started producing abstract drawings that became parts of what are become plans or organizational ideas of architecture. But they're going to have depth, and they're going to be three-dimensional. And it was just some sort of an invention where I found this thing that was between model and drawing, and it became kind of very much part of the practice. And now skip till 10 years ago, and I'm kind of focusing on this very particularly, and I'm looking for organizational ideas that go back to the onion skin. And I'm working now with a set of rules that are quite Darwinian. They have DNA material, and it's very straightforward. There's 8 kind of elements that make this thing up. And I'm writing a system that organizes them, that produces something that develops an idea of coherency, that challenges classical notions that have to do with repetition, have to do with symmetry, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm looking for variation, going back to Solowit, right? That I'm writing a set of rules, but I'm looking for the degree of differentiation, because these all belong to the same family, right? And I'm maintaining that the site is the square, is still the site, and it's a limit, but now the site also becomes a variable in terms of how I deal with the edge. And well, several things have hugely changed now. The model came first, and now these are drawings that analyze, each of these belong to one of those pieces. But they're now CAT scans that come from the three-dimensional thinking. And again, the most basic thing in architectural thinking is you draw, you make plan and section, and that turns into a three-dimensional thing, and you could either draw it or you model it and you construct it, right? Because we work in the three-dimensional world. And this is really starting now to move me more and more to an interest of this as a very autonomous thing that has its own kind of thrust and kind of direction. And it's definitely going to be affecting the work and how we're going to kind of construct the first ideas of the work. And it's going to develop with the system, going back to Solowit, comes the rigor, and that's everything. That's Miles Davis. The further out you want to make something that challenges normal coherency, the more the more discipline, the more rules you have to have that control that. If you're interested in making something that has any kind of coherence, that isn't just random, right? And then I thought, again, I'm going to remind you that I am an architect, and so you can see a piece of those drawings, and now it's getting translated into something that is going to connect to a site that in this time is going to turn into a campus we're going to build in Shanghai. But the first kind of direction of this project is now coming directly from things that are coming out of this work I'm doing in terms of the first plans or the first kind of ideas of where we're going to go. But as an architect, the drawings finally have to take they have huge amount of performances, environmental, functional, on and on. And I now have a system that I can look at this thing and I have multiple directions. So instead of 2 or 3 options, I'm getting more and more. I have more or less hundreds of options, and I can look at this thing in many ways, right? And I have the flexibility that deals with the reality of the changeability in the world today that you deal with. There's nothing that's kind of stable, right? And you need a method that's highly flexible and resilient to change. And it does this, right? And 2 things are happening now. I started off with Heiser. There's a connection between a broader ecological idea of site, and the site and building are doing this, right? And it's definitely comes directly from the influences of Heiser and Terrell, et cetera, rethinking the notion of the object and ground, right? And they're now manipulating ground. We're manipulating site. We're constructing site. And we're constructing site and building as kind of a single activity, right? And this is, again, and it gives us however we want to kind of talk about it. And then something else is happening. And I'm working collectively. I've always worked collectively. None of this is Thom Mayne. It's Thom Mayne directing, et cetera. And I'm working with computer people now and dealing in areas that are way beyond my understanding. And what's taking place now is that we're increasing the tools that allow us to work with multiple options that we can script. People are nodding their head, or the architects, right? And that completely changed kind of how we work. Because I'm now looking at that same direction of a piece, and I can go to another direction, and I can look at 100 of them, and it's completely changing my role as a creator. That I'm producing something that isn't mine in a traditional sense. I've developed the brain to make the thing, and I've given the rules of what that is, and I can now look at literally hundreds of options. And again, the discretionary choices are multiple, and it's challenging me to even start ask very different questions of kind of what my own intentionality and the own kind of progression of a piece as you're making decisions of going left or right, right? And it's having an effect on this. And then that's going to turn into work again, so that those organizational ideas are extremely useful to me. This is a competition for a park we won, and it's coming directly now from a set of ideas where I can take landscape and building and organize them together and make something coherent and produce quite a complex organization, which includes soccer fields and libraries and cultural facilities, et cetera, that end up this in the most pragmatic way, right? So again, there's this kind of, in this part of my life, there's this collision between the abstractness of these pieces and their ultimate reality into the built world. And it's shift in how I'm making architecture and the location of the architecture. And it's radically changing the language, and it's allowing me to move in a very intimate way with the people I'm working with at a very kind of high speed, right? It's absolutely changing how I've worked even 10 years ago. And then a transition into what you're looking at in the gallery. COVID, is that 4 years now? I'm drawing, and I'm giving myself a rule of 3 minutes, 4 minutes, and I'm producing a piece of work, very simple, and I'm looking at variation and organization, and I'm making kind of random shapes that are located somewhere. I'm looking at certain things. It might be graffiti, it might be photographs I have, and I'm looking at making an organization that somehow it talks about coherency, that's organized, that's trying to organize randomness, and I'm still in this territory of looking at randomness and using that as the primary idea. And then the last slide, I'm taking the sketch and I'm now I'm putting it within the precision of a computer language, and it has. I'm trying to maintain the human nature of the sketch, the line, and that'll be part of the future of these things, and then I'm recognizing that I'm using various layers of things that I've done in my life. I'm still drawing old school, and I'm producing something, and I'm making the line that produces the object, and I'm leaving the line as a history of making that, and that's what these are. The lines you're looking at were, if I made it by hand, it'd be the line I made to make that shape. But what's happening now is I'm putting it in a 3D environment. And so the work, I think, is coming out from a kind of I don't think many artists would go in this direction. It's definitely coming out of my architectural thinking, because these are drawings that represent three-dimensional thinking. So I'm putting these objects in, and they're rotating through in X, Y, Z. And because of that, there's no line that's self-similar. Every line is different, right? And with the tool I have, I get infinity. It's a big number, right? And what I'm trying to get, and what these sketches show, is my hand is still, I'm trying to find a place where I've still, my own self is still there, right? And the sense is that whether they were done by hand or this, and what this is doing is it's increasing the discipline and the rigor and the precision, which again, I'm going to parallel to a Miles Davis, that I'm going to need as the work gets more complicated, that I need that precision. And there's some sort of a dialogue between the precision and the randomness that's clear, right? Or it makes the randomness absolutely kind of conscious because of the nature of the precision. And then they are going to, I'm starting to just ask questions of what these things are. I don't know. They're not representational. They operate on, I have a petri dish, and I'm deciding on 6 primitives, the DNA matter, and I develop a system of how they behave, right? And I come in the morning and I look at 100 options, and I look at the petri dish and I ask, what is it? Is it a zebra or an amoeba or a snake? But it's mine. I made it. That make sense? But it's not like I'm used to doing something consciously, and you're doing something, and if you make it, you're, quote, in control of it or something, right? And I'm not. I did do it, and I understand the system because I invented the brain, and I understand the DNA because I put in the DNA, and they're very particular DNA that I put in. And now I'm getting feedback. I look at it and I go, where are we? Let's change the behavior of how it touches the edge. Or let's have more numbers of element A and less of element E, et cetera, right? And I go to work talking about it to see where it's taking us, to understand the system I invented that is somewhat intuitive, and I'm now trying to figure out what is this thing I invented, right? And I'm asking questions, and it's we're just listening to a piece. It'll be about failure. I think one of the most basic notions of any creative act is failing, and that you have to learn how to fail and fall forwards. And for me, this has been a really interesting notion that I'm constantly failing because I'm not even quite sure where I'm going, and I'm looking at something and I'm deciding kind of what do I do with this thing in front of me. And now I'm completely kind of resolved to my intuitive notion of, in certain notions of kind of where taking somebody, and it's kind of going somewhere. And I'm now also aware that given the Darwinian notion of controlled behavior or consistent behavior, which is the basis of all living things, that there's still some notion of potential figuration. And so I'm looking at something and I'm discussing, seems like the petri dish, I've got kind of plant material, because we're asking, is it flora or fauna, right? And I'm going, let's kind of work with something and invent our own flora. And so it's funny, in our first show, we were next to a painting by Hockney, and it was really lovely. It was a jar of flowers, and he's a kind of serious guy. And I'm going, damn, he's actually painting a bowl of flowers. And we had our piece up, and it's our landscape. We invented the landscape, right? We made the forest, if we want to call it a forest. And in this case, I'm using it just it seemed to be useful, et cetera. But again, we're just opening up and kind of asking questions, and then ourselves making a decision if something somehow is doing something that's compelling and is taking us someplace as we keep through this process. And they're relational. That's a whole discussion. I can only see them in a triptych. A pair is always, the symmetry is kind of another thing. But I can only see them as relational because they're all part of an infinite process. So every one of these, I have infinite number of variations. I can take the piece, given the system, right? And for me, because of that, I'm most interested in their relational characteristic. That you're looking at something that they're all part of the same species, and they have the same differentiation we do as human characters, right? But they're all, you could locate within some place. And then it just opens up huge amount of conversations that out of this comes an interest in dynamicism, a certain energy, a certain emotional content. And maybe that's finally, I can't talk about it, but I'm finally interested in discussing the nature of us as human characters. And it has some sense of a spirit or something we call a soul, right? And the human being still relies on this thing that's highly developed through the computer. And my role is to find through that technology the essence of the human character, whoever I am or whatever we are. And at the same time, being aware that this is still continually a part of the few images I showed you, but that'd be a much longer conversation, that I myself look at this and go, Silhouette, one conversation, Pollock, another conversation, art, another conversation, the dropping stuff on the ground, I get it. We're doing that too. We're kind of dropping in our petri dish, but I got a computer that's kind of mixing it up and doing it in a little more complicated way. But it was a century, right, ago. And I'm still interested in this idea of randomness and chance, where and then you look at Duchamp, of course, and as an architect, it's highly rational, the three stoppages. And he's looking at what a lot of people don't ask, is they talk about the randomness of these chords that hit the ground as he drops them. He chose one. It never occurred to me until I'm doing these pieces, that question. Wait a minute, I know that argument, but just like he did, I had to choose one, and she chose one, right? And they're maybe not infinite, but they were close to infinite. But they're also like, and then of course Pollock got it away, it's absolutely Darwinian in the sense that it's acting through the force of gravity. And it's absolutely kind of rational in that sense. He's dropping something, and it's absolutely predictable. The number of variations today you could do on a computer, right? And we could predict the number of variations. You could decide how many of those are really differentiated literally, and there might be a couple dozen or something, right? And we could do that today. And or I can go to Pollock and look at that, and it looks about just mechanical. Some of his work is so accurate. I connect it to Stephen Curry. He has incredible muscle memory, right? They're just absolutely amazing. And that, if we could go into other questions that might be, we could talk about it later. It goes about the delivery. And again, I'm highly aware that one of the conversations taking place for the last century is the method of delivery. And now I'm using, again, a state-of-the-art process of printing three-dimensionally in a machine that there's two in the States that was invented hours ago. Days ago, and they're highly ephemeral. And again, as an architect, we've been making mechanical models now from the beginning, 95, And I remember when the modern took some of my pieces in New York, I was going, why would you want these? These are kind of physical white models that are made on a machine. And they're going, oh, no. These are going to be actually 50 years from now, are going to be quite rare because that technology is only going to be around for a couple of years. Sure enough, we don't have the machine anymore. And we have a new machine. And those models were worth, what, 15 years of models? And it was. And this will be the same way. There's a kind of ephemerality here. And the delivery method is going to be something that's absolutely located to this particular time in history. And we'll have another system of delivering it. And again, and then it also opens up the notion of the relationship. If I talk to friends of mine that are classical painters, and we go back and forth. Kim, we were talking about with Cecily. She's wrapped up still in the material notion of putting paint on canvas, and it's very much part of her thinking is the mechanical act of that. And that's not something I'm interested in. And I want to say one last thing. In some ways, I think it's connected to definitely the educational processes. When I went to school, I'm using a slide rule, and I think the ratio was something like 50 or 60% of my time was physical and 40 was mental. My boys, who had a Texas Instrument at 7 years old, they now look at their education and it's like 80% mental and 20% physical, right? And the mistakes I'm making as a young person, I moved the slide rule in the wrong direction, is connected to the physical act, and they're just doing this. And these have some of the same notion that several people asked me about how long it takes. And I had to really kind of rethink this, and then it ended up being, for me, kind of interesting. They were thinking about painting traditionally, and they're like talking to the conventional painter. And you happen to be very quick or very slow or whatever it is. I remember I first met you when Schaefer was here, and he's slow. And so he gets 7 paintings out a year, and it takes him a long time. It's irrelevant. I spent no time mechanically. I spent 2 months making the painting, but it's here, not here, right? So it's really interesting. It starts even discussing kind of where the work comes from, right? And it's not that there's no effort involved in it because you haven't physically produced it. You have produced it, but it's more and more a mental activity of thinking kind of what the thing is. That make sense? I mean, it's really kind of straightforward. That's kind of it.
You mentioned failing forward in terms of doing something and having it fail, but you fail forward in a positive way. And I think of things where they used to be where considerable effort went into that failure that maybe went forward. It seems to me through a set of rules and the way you approach things, you can fail forward at a huge rate, huge speed, and see the outcomes of the failures and then selectively choose the things that were not failures.
It increases the speed of failure.
Yeah, the speed of failure.
Absolutely.
I hadn't thought about that. That's a good one. Yeah. Funny, it's interesting, as a teacher, a professor, it's an issue with young people today of not, in my sense, is having a more difficult notion of failure. And it would be the opposite. You need to learn to fail quicker and more often, because that's literally how you produce something if you're interested in creativity is based on that. I mean, it's literally the foundation of any creative act. But that would be within any territory. Steve Jobs would have said the same thing. We could run it would be kind of really basic.
I felt like relatively early on in your lecture, you were looking for some kind of truth in the world. And you ended really talking about our place in it in terms of kind of the chaotic nature of things, but staying really regimented. This is perhaps an inappropriate question, but are you a spiritual person? Are you somebody who is a scientific minded? Are you looking for some kind of truth in the world through your work? You talk about it coming through you, and it's a mental exercise more than a physical one. Is that something that is part of your practice in any way?
That's a kind of a loaded.
You can also just
would have
push
to-
that
you would-
aside.
You would have to define spiritual, and I think of myself as a spiritual person, but maybe not vaguely in the terms that you're talking about, not within the institutional sense. And at that level, I'm a very unspiritual person, and I have no interest in when any philosophy, religion, etc., becomes institutionalized. I have no interest in it whatsoever, and I actually think it's destructive. I'd be on the other end of the spectrum. Spiritual terms of the sense of the who you are, the depth of your emotional life, and of your public life, and your ethical life. It's hard to answer that question without sounding arrogant. If you answer yes or no, you're screwed both ways.
I just mean like also your relationship
I'm
to the
interested
natural
in
world.
the. I can get it down to something. I'm interested in the human act that connects to making these things, and I've left elements purposely that are very conventional, like the line that made the piece that has to do with the convention of drawing in a very historical sense. And then after that, I can't. You have to. We had a show just before the last year in Vancouver, and several people walked in the room and thought I was really emotionally strong. That meant a lot to me because I don't know, but I'm interested in that, right? That if in fact out of this, and that'd be my critique of Saul LeWitt's pieces I showed you, they're missing some more complex personal thing. They're way too rationalized and intellectual for me, and I want something that has something we call intuition, and intuition is nothing more but the summation of information that you absorb instantaneously and you can put out instantaneously, and it's a particular type of intelligence, right? That takes place without over intellectualizing it or without over ordering it or editing maybe, right? And that it seems like that's been a notion, an understanding of art from the beginning of time, and it's why you purposely work in ways that challenge the consciousness or challenge a priori ideas by doing things that just take place. Some of those were made listening to music. Some of those were made at 4 in the night, being stoned, and on. And that's old school. That's back in the 60s and 70s, all right? And today, again, we can find some of that, and we can kind of advance it. It goes back to the cyborg that I've got now, tools that kind of advance my own ability. And if I'm interested right now in something that's kind of occupying me, is that I'm fascinated with the idea of the potential of doing work that's beyond your normal capability. And I see the tool not as AI at all. I mean, that's another conversation. It doesn't matter whether I'm interested or not, but that's not what I'm interested in at this time. That it's really interesting to me that I'm producing work that goes beyond my own capacity. And that's what gets me interested. And I'm looking at what I did at one point in my life, and it's mine. And I did all of this, and I owned it. And I do this, and I go, oh, kind of weird. I didn't actually put one line down myself. They're all my lines. But they came out of the ordering I did, and they weren't a line that I chose to be in that place. And what took place, instead of looking at kind of things singularly, I'm looking at things integratively. And so when I look at the thing, and I'm looking at 100 of them, I'm looking at the capacity of these various systems to make something that has to do with the summation of literally hundreds of thousands. I have no idea, there's a couple million discrete pieces of information in every one of these paintings, right? It's digital, right? And I've controlled every dot, right? And I'm able to look at them and now make discretions. I can both, I'm looking at 200, let's call them mistakes, things I'm not using for the one I took. And I'm not unused to doing that, but I'm used to looking at 3 or 4, right? Or I've done like painters will do a sketch and do a few things with painting before they invest the time to do the painting, etc. And now I can look at huge numbers of things to get feedback, and then I can rewrite the direction of the painting, I can decide, no, let's go someplace else. Or these are all come out of the same thinking. So it went from there to that one. And then I look at this one, I go, oh, something that's working for me on this one. And some of it's material. It could be concrete. You don't quite know what it is. And I'm really interested in that. So that somebody asked me, you call them paintings. I have no idea. I'm calling them paintings, but they kind of look like paintings. I need an idea what to call them. But it's a bit concrete, or it's something else that I'm interested in that could be a fresco, or could connect to other kind of notions. And I'm precisely interested because I'm not even clear what the material is, and that itself is interesting to me. And then you feed that in the next loop of the next piece you're working with. And again, the variation of the things here came out of that. And then some of them are clearly connected to the convention of painting that I want. I'm interested in the materiality. Oh, I didn't say that. I'm interested in challenging the reproduction of computer pieces on screens. That if you see these on the screens, you get a vague image, but you have no notion of seeing it, especially the ones in the other room. You'd have to see the piece. In fact, I'm still learning. I'm finding out that they're three-dimensional, right? As the three-dimensional or horizontal, they work a little stronger because of lighting, and they're more powerful. I'm going, oh, okay, that's just another of the one of hundreds of kind of piece of data you're putting in your head, but I'll leave thinking that. I know that's how they behave. And so there is a feedback loop between the material thing that goes back into it also in a conventional way, right? The way it would be for a traditional painter. And I'm aware of Bacon and going, the next set of these, it's going to get a little thicker and a little bigger, and there'll be a piece of a little raw, because he's a person I tremendously admire, and then you're going to, or Richter, the squeegee ones. I remember we caught a show in Paris. They're just, you could spend hours on one of those things, but you'd have to see it. It's not transferable. It's not reproducible on a computer. It has a physicality. And then again, my instinct as an architect and as a painter or whatever are parallel. It's still connected to the material. And in no way, like a lot of the digital stuff I find really fascinating, but it's not whether you like it or don't like it. It's not my project. It's another project. I'm still kind of linked to the physical, and in that sense, again, I'm very conventional.
So listening to your lecture, I would say that we're talking about. In listening to your lecture, I would say that you're talking exclusively about the work in the small room. You haven't said word one that I heard about color. And what's most immediate about your work is not the lines, it's the color.
Interesting. You asked a tough question. Funny, it's been a conversation we've had here. You're dead right. That's my room. That's the one I'm really comfortable with. If you looked at my work, I've never used color. It's material. It's concrete and wood and steel, raw steel, and the color is secondary. That's the absorption of client, and it's also ephemeral. You get to paint a wall, or you get to put a big painting in it, and that's the part that changes. But the thing I'm building, I'm still super old-fashioned in building something that has kind of a longevity, and I'm still the old-fashioned of architecture. I'm going to be closer to Kahn or whatever that's lasting, and it's going to show up in this work. And so, God, it's really interesting. And that's the room that connects to my tradition. This is an experiment. Where's Peter? You here? Where'd he go? Oh, you're over here. Okay. I came in. One of the first days. He said, "Well, I like this one." I'm expanding here, and I'm trying to figure out. I like the emotional nature of the last one I showed you, whatever it is, and I'm dancing with my own insecurity and the notion of experimenting, and color's a new territory for me, and it's more difficult. I'm just experimenting with it, and I'm not. It's just part of the process, but it's a really interesting observation, because it's absolutely, for me, it's very clear that that's a room I'm comfortable with. But that's also interesting. The fact that I'm comfortable with it kind of tells me probably should going to spend some more time in this room because that one I can do that on kind of automatic cruise control now, and I've already got a whole new set of pieces that are going to be there that are already in the works, and I'm still kind of thinking about what it means to talk about it and think about it. I'm not clear yet, right? But it's really interesting kind of observation, and I guess it would connect from my the landscape stuff, right? Yeah.
Firstly, thank you very much for your time tonight. Absolutely fascinating. But I wanted to ask you about space and the relationship between the two-dimensional work and the three-dimensional work, because your architecture is really living sculptures. And if you, with the finished product, do you think about how your viewer moves through the space, obviously through the three-dimensional work? You're imagining the viewer throughout the space, but with the two-dimensional work, even though it is three-dimensional on a two-dimensional surface, does that come into mind with the interaction? So when we come into the gallery, where does the work begin when you come up to it? As you come up to...
It was how the viewer thinks about
how
that.
the viewer...
I never think about the viewer. Never.
All right.
In my mind, once you produce something for somebody else, you're done. Your career is over. You have no possibility of producing anything. And I think anybody in any art form would say the same thing, that you cannot be serious. I have a hard enough time figuring out what I think about it. How the hell can I worry about how somebody else feels about it? And then again, within, certainly my generation, within global thinking, you understand that architecture is architecture, that art in general is a cultural phenomena. And the question would be, whose criterion are you even trying to please? If you're coming from Bangkok, or you could go on and on, and it's irrelevant. The 3D thing, though, I didn't mention, that is going to show up in the next group. I'm combining my reliefs in the 3D pieces with painting, and I'm about to produce, they're not in this group, a series of pieces that combine the two, and I'm also getting rid of the frame. My two directions I'm going. But what you're looking at also, it probably doesn't matter. If they're spatial, and some of them are more spatial than others, they should be because they're three-dimensional. Right. And that's a private, I'm operating three-dimensionally, and you're looking at an abstract 2D thing of something that is three-dimensional in its process, so it would not be surprising that it's depth. And in our own evaluation, I'm using that as an evaluation of choosing certain pieces that have clear notions of depth. So I'm very clear on those pieces over here that the black surfaces are kind of voids, and they're giving this thing dimensionality as you're moving through that, and we could go through and look at the various pieces. And I'm highly conscious of that. And then with that comes the use of various colors, and you realize that it's quite complicated. It's not always that dark colors recede. I can make white colors do that, and again, you're dealing in a whole new territory that has to do with the notion of the piece and the production of space.
Sure. Thank you.
And that's obviously a really key, kind of incredibly interesting kind of territory.
Right.
And it's also going back to the derivation of the thing. And what I'm going to show in the new set of pieces, I'm going to show you the location of this thing three-dimensionally, literally. So the painting is you're going to dig into the painting, and it's going to be, it'll be going back to the early pieces I saw. I'm going to connect those pieces, right, and painting together.